On my wedding day, my sister handed me a beautifully wrapped vintage wooden box. Before my fingers could even touch the ribbon, my husband gripped my wrist with an iron-like hold. The digital face of his military smartwatch was flashing a sharp, aggressive, rapid red light. He stared directly at my sister, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "You brought a threat into my home." The smug smirk on my sister's face vanished instantly as the 6 Navy SEALs sitting at the head table stood up in perfect unison. "My name is Maddie. I'm 33 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I was the family punching bag. I worked my way up from nothing to become a senior data architect for a major financial firm. My parents, however, always treated me like an inconvenience, only useful when they needed someone to pick up the check. I thought my wedding day would be the exception. I was wrong." Before we get into the rest of this story, let me know in the comments below where you're watching from, and if you've ever had to stand up to relatives who tried to bring you down, hit that like button and subscribe. The reception was held at a stunning waterfront estate in Maryland. Crystal chandeliers caught the evening light, and the champagne was flowing. Sitting next to me was my new husband, David Thorne. At 36, David was a Navy SEAL commander, disciplined, razor-sharp, and fiercely loyal. He gave me a sense of security I had never experienced with my own flesh and blood. My parents, Richard and Patricia, sat at the main table, doing what they do best, making the entire evening about themselves and my sister, Brittany. Brittany, who is 30, is the undisputed golden child of the family. She spends her life chasing social media clout, projecting an illusion of extreme wealth while drowning in debt. She recently married Jamal, a brilliant and highly respected orthopedic surgeon. Jamal is a genuinely good man, incredibly kind and hard-working, but he was completely blind to the toxic reality of the family he had married into. My parents doted on Brittany and Jamal, introducing them to my husband's military colleagues as if Brittany were the one getting married. Every time someone congratulated me, my mother would quickly pivot, reminding everyone of how gorgeous Brittany's destination wedding had been the previous year, or bragging about Jamal's recent medical conferences. I held David's hand under the table, doing my best to ignore the sting of their blatant disregard. The sharp chime of a silver fork against a crystal glass quieted the roaring room. Brittany strutted to the microphone in the center of the dance floor, smoothing down a beaded designer gown I knew she couldn't afford on her maxed-out credit cards. She flashed her signature, camera-ready smile. "Hi, everyone," Brittany began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I'm Maddie's younger sister, though honestly I've always been the outgoing one." A few awkward chuckles rippled through the hall. I shifted in my seat, knowing exactly what was coming. "When Maddie told us she was marrying David, we were all in shock," Brittany continued, leaning into the microphone and pacing slightly. "I mean, my sister has always been our little data nerd, sitting in dark rooms, staring at numbers. She's worked so hard just to blend in with normal people. We were worried she'd end up living with a dozen computer servers instead of making friends. So, imagine our surprise when she brings home a military man, a man whose entire job revolves around taking orders and handling heavy hardware." You see, the air left the room instantly. David's colleagues, seasoned combat veterans and high-ranking officers, stared at her with expressions as cold as stone. Beside me, David's jaw tightened, but he remained perfectly still, the mark of a trained professional assessing a hostile situation. My father, Richard, actually laughed out loud, while my mother, Patricia, beamed at Brittany as if she had just delivered a comedic masterpiece. Jamal, however, looked mortified. He shifted heavily in his chair, throwing an apologetic glance toward David and me, rubbing the back of his neck, wishing he could disappear. "But we really are so happy for you, Maddie," Brittany pressed on, completely oblivious to the heavy, suffocating tension she had just created. "To officially welcome David to the family, Mom, Dad, and I wanted to give you something special tonight." She gestured to a catering staff member who brought out a heavy, dark mahogany box. It looked like an antique, polished to a high shine, with an intricate brass latch securing the lid. Brittany scooped it up, her heels clicking loudly against the hardwood floor as she marched directly toward our table. "It's a family heirloom," Brittany said, holding the heavy box out to me, a look of triumphant superiority on her face. "It's been passed down for generations, and we decided today was the day to hand it over. Consider it a token of our family opening its doors to your new husband." I reached out, a forced, polite smile on my face, wanting nothing more than to take the box, say thank you, and end this painful public display. But right before my fingers could make contact with the polished wood, David moved. It was a blur. His hand shot out, wrapping around my wrist with firm, immovable strength, halting my hand mid-air. "Do not touch that," David commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried an authority that cut through the quiet room like a serrated blade. I looked at him, utterly confused. "David, what's wrong?" I asked, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. David didn't answer me immediately. His eyes were locked on his left wrist. He wore a highly specialized military-grade tactical smartwatch, a piece of gear he never took off, not even for our wedding photos. Right now, the digital display, usually dim, was pulsing with a rapid, blinding, aggressive red light. It was an anomalous frequency alert. David stood up slowly, pushing his chair back. The easygoing groom from 5 minutes ago was entirely gone, replaced by a cold Navy SEAL commander. He walked around the table, putting himself directly between me and Brittany, his broad shoulders completely cutting off my view of her. Brittany took a step back, her arrogant smile faltering for the first time. "What is your problem?" she scoffed, though her voice carried a distinct tremor. "It's just a wedding gift. Take the box, Maddie." David looked down at her, his expression devoid of warmth, courtesy, or hesitation. "You brought a threat into my home," he said, in a dangerous, icy whisper that sent a shiver straight down my spine. Before my parents could voice their outrage from their seats, the atmosphere in the ballroom shifted violently. The 6 men sitting at the table closest to us, David's groomsmen, all active-duty Navy SEALs, stood up in absolute unison. The screech of heavy chairs against the floor was loud and harsh. Their movements were perfectly coordinated, their eyes locked onto the trembling wooden box in Brittany's hands. The soft, romantic lighting of the venue suddenly felt like the harsh glare of an interrogation room, and the arrogant superiority on my sister's face shattered into pure, unadulterated fear. "Clear the immediate radius," David ordered sharply, his voice carrying the tactical precision of a command that left zero room for discussion. The 6 men didn't hesitate. Their movements were fluid, disciplined, and efficient, an unsettling sight at a wedding reception. 2 of them stepped cleanly in front of the main table, creating a physical wall that prevented my parents from lunging forward. Another stepped behind Brittany, cutting off any path of retreat. A groomsman named Carter, a massive man with piercing grey eyes, stepped forward and gently but firmly pried the heavy mahogany box from Brittany's shaking fingers. Before she could even process what was happening, the whispers among the wedding guests swelled into a wave of panic and confusion. People stood up, craning their necks to see what had caused the groom and his entire wedding party to go into a defensive stance. "David, what is happening?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins.
"In my watch," David replied, his eyes never leaving Brittany. "It's equipped with a localized radio frequency detector designed to alert me to unauthorized transmissions and data extraction attempts within a 10-foot radius. The moment she brought that box close to our table, the proximity sensor redlined. That object is actively broadcasting."
"You're insane," Brittany stammered, her voice pitching an octave higher. She took another step back, nearly tripping over the hem of her beaded gown. "It's a wooden box. It's a family antique. You military guys are completely paranoid. Mum, tell them to stop acting like psychopaths." Patricia tried to push past the groomsmen blocking her path, her face flushed with fury. "Release my daughter's gift right now," my mother shouted, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You are ruining this reception. Maddie, tell your husband to call off his attack dogs." I didn't say a word. I just stood beside David, watching the scene unfold with a strange sense of detachment. For 33 years I had been conditioned to apologize, to smooth things over, to take the blame whenever my family caused a scene. But not tonight. Tonight I had backup. "Open it," David ordered Carter, completely ignoring my mother. Carter took the box over to a nearby vacant cocktail table. He set it down, carefully inspecting the brass latch and the heavy velvet lining visible inside. Reaching into his formal jacket, he pulled out a matte black tactical multi-tool, clicking open a small flat steel blade. He ran his fingers along the inside edges of the box, pressing against the velvet. False bottom, Carter reported, his tone entirely level. Internal depth doesn't match external dimensions.
He wedged the blade into the tiny seam where the velvet met the mahogany edge and twisted. With a sharp crack that resonated through the silent room, the wood splintered and popped loose.
A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Even Jamal, standing a few paces behind his wife, went entirely rigid. Nestled in a custom-carved recess beneath the velvet lay a highly sophisticated, high-tech piece of black market equipment. It consisted of a high-capacity lithium battery pack, a cellular transmitter, and a miniature microphone wired directly into a GPS module. In the centre, a tiny green light pulsed steadily, broadcasting its active status to whoever held the receiver. "Active localized signal interceptor," Carter announced, looking up at David. "It's recording audio and utilizing the local Wi-Fi network to transmit data. This isn't consumer electronics. This is military grade, or very close to it. Civil possession of this is highly illegal." As a senior data architect, I stared at that blinking green light, my mind instantly analyzing the threat. This wasn't a simple tracking device. An apparatus like this was capable of cloning keystrokes, intercepting two-factor authentication codes, and bypassing secure networks. If this box had been placed in our home, near my work laptop, it would have granted complete access to every confidential financial portfolio I managed. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My sister, the woman who had spent her entire life belittling my intelligence, had just handed me a highly targeted corporate espionage tool wrapped in a wedding bow. "What is the meaning of this?" Jamal demanded, stepping forward. His deep, commanding voice cut through the rising panic of the crowd. He looked at his wife, his expression shifting rapidly from embarrassment to deep, unsettling suspicion. As an orthopedic surgeon, Jamal was a man of science and facts. He knew what undeniable evidence looked like when it was staring him in the face. "Brittany, what exactly did you bring into this room?" The colour drained entirely from Brittany's face. Her heavy makeup now looked like a mask, pasted onto a ghost. She looked like a trapped animal, her eyes darting frantically between the exposed device, her angry husband, and the wall of Navy SEALs standing at absolute attention. "I don't know," she stammered, her voice high and trembling. "I bought it at an antique store. The man told me it was a vintage music box. I swear I had no idea that was inside." David took a slow, deliberate step toward her. The sheer, overwhelming presence of my husband forced Brittany to cower against the edge of a table. Do not insult my intelligence," David said, his voice dangerously calm. "A device like this requires manual activation. It requires a paired receiver. It requires someone to intentionally plant it, charge it, and hand-deliver it. You didn't buy this at an antique shop. You brought a targeted surveillance tool to a gathering full of active military personnel and federal contractors. Do you have any idea what you've just done?" The absolute severity of the situation finally settled over the room. This was no longer a family drama or a bad joke. This was a major security breach. Planting a surveillance device on a Navy SEAL commander was a federal offense. Brittany shook her head frantically, tears welling up in her eyes. It was her typical, predictable defense mechanism, crying to garner sympathy and deflect accountability. But the SEALs remained completely unmoved by her theatrics. "I swear," she screamed, reaching out desperately toward our parents' table. "Mum, Dad, tell them I would never do this. This is a mistake. Maddie put it there. Maddie just wants to humiliate me, because she's always been jealous of me and Jamal." It was a desperate, pathetic redirection. She was standing right in front of the dismantled box, the blinking green light exposing her undeniable guilt, and she was still trying to play the victim. David didn't entertain her performance for a single second. He turned to Carter, his voice carrying absolute command. "Secure the device, isolate the signal, and ensure no one leaves this ballroom until I say otherwise." A wave of frightened murmurs broke out among the wedding guests. The glamorous, expensive reception had officially become a lockdown. My heart hammered against my ribs, but for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to shrink away or apologize for my family's toxic behavior. I stood tall beside my husband, watching the house of cards my family had built finally begin to collapse. The shock of David's command lasted exactly 3 seconds before my mother broke the silence. Patricia lunged forward, her face contorted into a mask of ugly indignation. She pushed past her chair, her voice cutting through the panic filling the room. "Are you out of your mind?" my mother shrieked, pointing a manicured finger directly at David's chest. "Locking down a wedding? You're acting like a paranoid militant. It's just a prank tracker." She marched toward the cocktail table where Carter was isolating the device, but another groomsman instantly crossed his arms, blocking her path. Outraged, Patricia gasped and turned to my father for support. Richard puffed out his chest and stepped up beside his wife, attempting to project a united front of parental authority. "Your mother is right," Richard boomed, trying to use his booming corporate executive voice on my husband. "You military types take yourselves far too seriously. We knew you two were keeping your honeymoon destination a secret, and Brittany thought it would be hilarious to put a little GPS tracker in the gift so we could see what tropical island you were hiding out on. It's a joke, an innocent family prank." I stared at the two people who had raised me. For decades they had spun lies to protect Brittany, warping reality to ensure I was always the villain and she was always the victim. But hearing them defend a military-grade data sniffer as an innocent prank was a whole new level of delusion. I looked at Jamal. He was slowly shaking his head, his eyes locked onto his wife. As a surgeon, he understood complex technology and precision. He knew a sophisticated surveillance tool wasn't something you just ordered off a novelty website for a laugh. "A prank?" I spoke up, my voice cutting through my mother's hysterics. "Mum, that is an active localized signal interceptor. It doesn't just track location. It clones keystrokes and steals network data. I manage confidential financial portfolios for a living. If I brought that into my home office, it would compromise millions of dollars in client assets. Does that sound like a honeymoon joke to you?" Patricia waved her hand dismissively, refusing to even look at the device. "Oh, stop using your technical jargon to make yourself sound important, Maddie. You always do this. Always trying to make Brittany look bad because you can't stand her having the spotlight." She grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin through the lace of my wedding dress. "Look at your sister. She's terrified. You need to apologize to her right now and call off this ridiculous charade before you ruin your own wedding." Richard nodded firmly. "Your mother is absolutely right. You're embarrassing this family in front of our guests, Maddie. Tell your husband to have his friends stand down. We'll take the box back and forget this ever happened." The sheer audacity of their demand took my breath away. Standing in a room full of federal contractors and active duty military, they were asking us to overlook a major security threat, just to protect Brittany's feelings. They genuinely believed their parental authority superseded federal law. David stepped between me and my mother. His movement was fluid, but carried an irresistible force, firmly prying her hand away from my arm. His massive physical presence forced Patricia to take an awkward step back. He didn't yell or argue with them. He treated my parents like irrelevant background noise. David looked at Carter, who had just placed the dismantled surveillance unit into a specialized signal-blocking Faraday bag. Carter nodded, confirming the threat was temporarily neutralized, but the evidence was preserved. David pulled a secure smartphone from his inner jacket pocket. He dialed a number, his eyes never leaving Brittany, who was now trembling against a catering table. My mother opened her mouth to shout another demand, but David held up a single hand, his icy glare freezing the words right in her throat. "This is Commander David Thorne," he said, his voice echoing clearly in the dead silent room. "I have a Priority 1 security breach at my current location. I need an NCIS response team dispatched immediately. A civilian has placed an unauthorized active surveillance device on my person, targeting both military and confidential financial assets." My father's jaw dropped. My mother's furious tirade died instantly. The colour left Brittany's face entirely, and a small, terrified sob escaped her lips. They had spent their entire lives shouting their way out of consequences, bullying me into submission behind closed doors, and expecting the world to bend to their script. But as David provided the dispatcher with the exact address of our wedding venue, The terrifying reality finally hit them. This was no longer a family dispute they could manipulate. They had just triggered a federal investigation. My father stared at David for a heavy second, his face turning a furious shade of purple. He realized the manipulation that had worked on every principal, neighbor, and employer for the past 30 years had zero effect on a Navy SEAL. So he resorted to his ultimate defense mechanism. He decided to play the victim. "You think you can intimidate us with a phone call?" Richard roared, pulling his own smartphone from his tailored suit jacket. "We are law-abiding citizens. I'm calling the real police right now." He dialed 911, holding the phone to his ear while pointing a shaking, accusatory finger at my husband. "Yes, operator. I need the police at the waterfront estate immediately," he shouted, raising his voice so every terrified wedding guest could hear his performance. "We are being held hostage. A group of rogue military personnel are attacking my daughter and holding us here against our will. Please hurry, they've lost their minds." Patricia immediately joined the theatre. She let out a loud, dramatic wail, rushing over to throw her arms around Brittany, who was still cowering by the catering table. My mother glared at me with pure venom. "How could you let your husband do this to your own sister?" she wept. "You're a monster, Maddie, a jealous, vindictive monster." I just stood there, my posture straight, my chin held high. I felt a profound sense of clarity wash over me. For years they had gaslit me into believing I was the crazy one. They had woven their web of lies so tightly that I often questioned my own sanity. But watching them attempt to twist a targeted federal espionage plot into a story about a bullied little sister was pathetic. It was a masterclass in extreme narcissism, and it was failing spectacularly. The next few minutes felt suspended in time. The ballroom became a high-pressure cooker of anxiety. Guests whispered in hushed, frightened tones. David and his groomsmen didn't move an inch. They held the perimeter with terrifying discipline, faces completely blank, eyes scanning the room for any sudden movements. Carter remained steady at the cocktail table, guarding the signal-blocking bag containing Brittany's device. I glanced at Jamal. My brother-in-law, the brilliant orthopedic surgeon, stood a few paces away from his wife. His broad shoulders were tense, his deep dark eyes calculating. He was looking at Brittany, really looking at her, as if staring at a stranger inhabiting the body of the woman he had married. "Tell me the truth right now," Jamal demanded, his low voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Where did you get that device, Brittany?" Brittany fake sobbed, reaching a trembling hand out to him. "Baby, please, you have to believe me," she begged, tears smearing her heavy mascara. "I got it at an antique shop. Maddie is framing me. She's trying to ruin our lives because she's jealous of your success." Jamal didn't take her hand. He took a slow, deliberate step backward. His silence was deafening. He knew she was lying. The distant wail of sirens cut through the tense air of the ballroom. Red and blue emergency lights flashed frantically through the high, arched windows, casting eerie shadows over the elegant floral arrangements. The double doors of the venue were thrown open, and 2 local police officers rushed in, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts. They scanned the room, clearly expecting a drunken brawl or a violent hostage situation based on my father's hysterical 911 call. Richard and Patricia immediately ran toward the officers, waving their arms like shipwreck survivors spotting a rescue boat. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," my father panted, pointing at David and Carter. "Those men are holding my daughter hostage. They assaulted her, stole her private property, and are refusing to let anyone leave. You need to arrest them immediately." The lead officer, a young man, looked visibly overwhelmed by a room full of men in high-end tuxedos, radiating tactical menace. But he squared his shoulders and walked directly up to David. "Sir, I need you and your men to step back right now," the officer commanded, his hand resting on his radio. "Release the young lady and hand over whatever property you took from her. We're taking control of the situation." David didn't even blink. He stood his ground, radiating an absolute authority that made the local officer hesitate. "I am Commander David Thorne, United States Navy," David stated calmly. "We have just intercepted a black market surveillance device, actively transmitting local data. This is a federal security breach involving classified assets. We are maintaining this perimeter, until federal agents arrive. The local officer frowned, clearly annoyed by the challenge to his jurisdiction. "I don't care who you are or what branch of the military you serve in, pal," the cop shot back, raising his voice. "You're on my turf. You don't have the authority to detain civilians or confiscate property. Hand over the item and order your men to stand down, or I'm putting you all in handcuffs for unlawful restraint." The Navy SEALs didn't move a muscle. They didn't look at the officer. They kept their eyes on David, waiting for a nod, a command. The tension in the room spiked to a suffocating level. My mother shot a smug smile in my direction, clearly believing the local police were about to humiliate my husband. However, before the officer could even unclip his handcuffs, the violent, aggressive screech of tires against gravel erupted from the driveway outside. It was followed by the heavy, synchronized thud of car doors slamming shut. Through the glass entrance, 4 matte black SUVs could be seen boxing in the local police cruisers, completely cutting off the driveway. The venue doors were thrown open with immense force. A highly coordinated team of federal agents, dressed in tactical gear and navy blue windbreakers, with the word NCIS emblazoned in bold yellow letters, flooded into the ballroom. The lead agent, a stern-faced, tall man, walked directly up to the local police officer and flashed his federal credentials right in his face. "Naval Criminal Investigative Service," the lead agent announced, his voice carrying the finality of an absolute verdict. "We're taking over the scene. Step back, officers. This is now a federal crime scene." The local police immediately deflated, raising their hands in surrender and stepping away from David. They recognized instantly that they were completely outranked and outmatched. The lead agent turned to David, the two exchanging a crisp, professional nod. "Commander Thorne," the agent said, "where is the device and where is the suspect?" David pointed to the cocktail table where Carter stood guard. "The device is secured in the blocking bag. The suspect is the woman in the beaded dress." Brittany stared at the federal agents flooding the room. The absolute reality of her situation finally crashed down on her without mercy. My parents' manipulation tactics, their fake tears, their sense of affluent middle-class privilege, none of it meant anything to federal investigators. The terrifying prospect of a federal prison flashed in her wide, terrified eyes. Logic completely abandoned her. In a desperate, foolish, and incredibly reckless move, Brittany let out a blood-curdling shriek. She lunged forward, pushing past my mother, and sprinted toward the cocktail table. Her hands clawed wildly through the air, desperate to grab the signal blocking bag and smash the device before the agents could secure the evidence. She didn't even make it halfway. An NCIS agent moved with lightning speed. He intercepted her path, catching her outstretched wrists and smoothly twisting her arms behind her back in a textbook restraint. He pressed her face firmly down onto the clean white tablecloth, sending crystal champagne flutes shattering onto the floor. "Brittany Vance, you are under arrest for suspected federal espionage and unauthorized surveillance of a military official," the agent stated coldly, securing her arms. "Stop resisting." Patricia let out a scream that could have shattered the crystal centerpieces. She lunged at the federal agent, restraining her daughter, her manicured hands turning into claws. A second CIS agent effortlessly stepped into her path, raising a single black tactical gloved palm. "Step back, ma'am," the agent warned, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Interfering with a federal detention will result in your immediate arrest for obstruction of justice." Richard grabbed his wife by the waist, pulling her back forcefully. For all my father's corporate bluster and arrogance, he knew when he was thoroughly beaten. He recognized the heavy, uncompromising reality of federal law enforcement. He held Patricia tightly, his face pale and slick with a sudden cold sweat, watching his golden child pinned down against a catering table covered in broken glass. And then Jamal stepped forward. My brother-in-law moved with a calculated, precise grace. The movement of a man who spent his life operating on the human spine. As a highly respected orthopedic surgeon, Jamal was accustomed to high-stakes environments. He didn't yell or wave his arms like my parents. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored tuxedo, his dark eyes locked entirely on the woman pinned to the table. He walked up to the lead NCIS agent, his hands clearly visible, radiating a calm authority. "Agent," his deep voice cut through the panicked whispers of the wedding guests. "I am Dr. Jamal Vance. I am her husband. I understand you have protocol to follow, but she is unarmed and completely contained. Can I have 2 minutes to speak with my wife? Before you take her out of here, I need to understand what exactly is going on." The lead agent glanced at David. David gave a brief, barely perceptible nod. The agent holding Brittany relaxed his grip slightly, allowing her to stand upright, though he kept a firm hold on her upper arm. She looked completely disheveled. Her intricate updo was ruined, and champagne soaked the front of her expensive beaded gown. Jamal stepped into her line of sight. He didn't reach out to comfort her. He didn't offer a reassuring embrace. He stood perfectly still, looking at her with the same detached clinical scrutiny he used when assessing a complex fracture on an X-ray. "Brittany," Jamal said, his voice low and dangerously level. "Look at me." Brittany sobbed loudly, her chest heaving as she forced fresh tears down her cheeks. She leaned toward him, expecting the unconditional support she had always received from my parents. "Jamal, baby, you have to do something," she cried, her voice trembling with manufactured agony. "You have to call my lawyer. Maddie is framing me. She set this whole thing up to ruin my life." Jamal didn't even blink. He didn't reach for his phone. He just looked down at her. "Let's be very clear about the reality of this situation," Jamal stated, his voice completely stripped of its usual warmth. "You just handed a Navy SEAL commander a box packed with military-grade surveillance technology, in a room full of federal contractors, active military, and my own colleagues. Do not insult my intelligence by blaming your sister. I'm asking you once, and I want a direct answer. Where did you get that device?" Brittany swallowed hard, her eyes darting frantically around the room. She was looking for an escape route, a sympathetic face, anyone who would buy into her usual routine. But my parents were effectively silenced by the federal agents, and Jamal was refusing to play his assigned role. "I told you," Brittany stammered, her breathing rapid and shallow. "I bought it at a flea market downtown last week. I thought it was just a beautiful antique. The person who sold it to me must have left those strange electronics inside. I had absolutely no idea it was a tracker." Jamal crossed his arms over his chest. "A flea market?" he repeated blankly. "Yes," she insisted, nodding aggressively, causing a hairpin to drop to the floor with a tiny ping. "A little stall near the harbour. I paid cash for it." A muscle in Jamal's jaw twitched. As a surgeon, his entire career was built on spotting inconsistencies. He was a master at diagnosing problems by observing symptoms, and right now, his wife was displaying a textbook case of pathological deception. "Brittany," Jamal said softly, stepping a fraction of an inch closer. "Last week you told me you were in New York for a marketing seminar. Your credit card statements show you stayed at a luxury hotel in Manhattan. You couldn't have been at a flea market near the harbour." Brittany froze. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The panic in her eyes spiked. She realized she had just tripped over the web of lies she had woven too carelessly to keep the timeline straight. "Well, no, wait," Brittany scrambled, her voice pitching higher as she desperately tried to patch the hole in her story. "It wasn't last week. It was yesterday. Yes, yesterday afternoon. I went to a specialty gift shop in the suburbs. I bought it brand new. They must have left a security tag inside, and David is just overreacting." Jamal let out a slow, heavy breath. He looked down at her hands. Despite her frantic attempts to appear like an innocent victim, her physical markers completely betrayed her. Her fingers were trembling violently, vibrating with the massive surge of adrenaline released when a predator is cornered. Her pupils were dilated, and a fine sheen of cold sweat coated her forehead. "A security tag," Jamal repeated, shaking his head. "A security tag that requires a lithium battery pack and a cellular transmitter. A security tag that a team of Navy SEALs recognized as an active surveillance tool." Brittany tried to reach out to grab his jacket, but the federal agent sharply pulled her back. "Please, Jamal," she begged, her voice breaking. "Why are you doing this to me?" "Maddie gave me the box in the hallway right before the reception started. She told me to hand it to her as a peace offering. It's all her fault. She engineered this whole setup to humiliate me." Jamal stared at her in absolute silence. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and the truth was devastating. He calculated the 3 glaring inconsistencies she had presented in less than 60 seconds. First, she claimed she bought it at a flea market last week while she was supposed to be in New York. Second, she changed the story to a gift shop yesterday, calling it a simple security tag. Third, she abandoned the purchase narrative entirely, accusing me of handing it to her in a hallway. An impossible feat, considering I had been out on the estate lawn with David taking professional wedding photos for the entire hour leading up to the reception. Jamal turned back. He made eye contact with me, standing straight and firm beside my husband, protected by a wall of disciplined military personnel. He looked at my parents, cowering behind a federal agent, completely prepared to let their golden child drag everyone down with her. Finally, Jamal looked back down at the woman he had married. The illusion of the perfect, glamorous, high society wife evaporated instantly. He noted the violent shaking of her hands, the sweat on her brow, and the desperate, calculating glint in her eyes.
He realized he didn't know the woman standing in front of him at all. He had married a stranger, a pathological liar who had just committed a federal crime and was willing to destroy anyone to save herself.
"Agent," Jamal said, turning his back on Brittany completely. "You can take her away. I have nothing left to say to this woman." Brittany's screams echoed through the grand ballroom as the 2 federal agents marched her toward the exit. She thrashed wildly in their grip, the seams of her expensive beaded gown tearing, but the agents remained entirely indifferent to her hysterics. My mother collapsed into a nearby chair, burying her face in her hands and sobbing loudly, while my father stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. Jamal didn't look back. He straightened his suit jacket and walked out through a side exit, leaving his deceptive wife to the federal authorities. David wrapped a heavy protective arm around my shoulder, shielding me from the gaze of the remaining guests. Our bags were already packed and waiting in a limousine outside, ready to take us to a flight for a 2-week honeymoon in Maui. We were supposed to be sipping champagne at 30,000 feet by midnight, celebrating the start of our new life. Instead, David instructed our driver to skip the airport route and follow the convoy of black SUVs straight to the regional NCIS field office. The drive was painfully quiet. I stared out the tinted window of the limo, watching the city lights blur past. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the reception was slowly bleeding away, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. My own sister had attempted to place a surveillance device in my home. The betrayal was so absolute, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. The contrast upon arriving at the federal facility was jarring. I was still in my custom ivory wedding dress, the intricate lace dragging across the cold, scuffed linoleum floor of a secure briefing room. David sat next to me, his crisp tuxedo looking completely out of place under the harsh, humming fluorescent lights. We sat in silence for nearly 2 hours, while technical analysts dismantled the mahogany box in a secure lab down the hall. The heavy metal door clicked open, and the lead agent walked in, followed closely by a younger man carrying a ruggedized military-grade tablet. The lead agent introduced himself as Special Agent Reynolds, and the younger man as Hayes, a senior cyber intelligence analyst. There were no pleasantries, no apologies for ruining our wedding night. They operated with the same direct clinical efficiency David possessed, treating the situation with extreme gravity. Hayes placed his tablet on the stainless steel table between us. He tapped the screen, bringing up high-resolution photographs of the dismantled device hidden beneath the velvet lining of Brittany's gift. "Commander Thorne, ma'am," Hayes began, his eyes darting between David and me. "We've completed the initial hardware teardown. Your instincts were correct, Commander, but the scope of the threat is entirely different from what we originally assumed." David leaned forward, his posture rigid and commanding. "Explain." Hayes scrolled to a complex schematic of a circuit board. "This isn't a standard listening device. The microphone is secondary, almost an afterthought. The core of this unit is a highly modified enterprise-grade network penetrator. It is essentially a sophisticated Wi-Fi sniffer combined with a keystroke logger and an automated packet interceptor." I frowned at the technical terms, my professional instincts immediately kicking in. I dealt with corporate security protocols every day at my firm. "A packet interceptor?" I asked, my voice echoing slightly in the sterile room. Are you saying this device was engineered to intercept a local network traffic? Exactly. Hayes nodded, looking appreciative that I understood the terminology. If this box was placed in your home, it would create a shadow network that mimics your home router. It forces all your local devices, laptops, phones, smart TVs, to route their internet traffic through it before hitting the actual web. It's explicitly designed to harvest secure login credentials in real time. But modern financial security utilizes multi-factor authentication, I pointed out, my mind racing through potential vulnerabilities. Simply intercepting a password wouldn't be enough to breach a secure institutional system. That's the sinister part, Agent Reynolds interjected, leaning against the concrete wall with his arms crossed. The cellular transmitter wired to the battery pack is programmed to execute a simultaneous bypass. It captures the initial login, intercepts the two-factor authentication token sent to the user's phone, which sits on the same compromised network, and transmits both to a remote, offshore server within a fraction of a second. Whoever built this wanted live, unrestricted access to a highly secure network. David scowled, staring at the glowing schematic on the tablet. My operational hardware is protected behind multiple layers of military firewalls. I don't bring Department of Defense intelligence onto a civilian home network. A device like this would be entirely useless against a Navy SEAL's encrypted drives. It would just bounce off the outer security shell and trigger a local lockout. The room went dead silent. David and the two federal agents looked at the tablet, trying to make the logic fit. It made no sense for a civilian to target a military commander with a digital weapon that couldn't even penetrate his base armor. But I knew. The realization hit me like a freight train. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, and the heavy fabric of my wedding dress suddenly felt suffocating. My breath caught in my throat as the pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind, forming a picture so sinister it was almost impossible to comprehend.
It wasn't meant for you, David, I whispered, my voice trembling with a mixture of dawning horror and absolute fury.
David turned to me, his brow furrowed with deep concern. What do you mean? I looked up at Agent Reynolds and Hayes, meeting their sharp gazes. I'm a senior data architect. I design and manage the back-end database structures for one of the largest financial institutions on the East Coast. I work from a home office regularly. When I log in, I have access to the institutional banking nodes that control highly confidential financial portfolios. I pointed a shaking finger at the image of the device on the tablet screen. Brittany isn't a spy. She doesn't care about military secrets or naval deployments. That device was meant to sit on a shelf in my living room, designed to capture my corporate credentials and give someone remote, unrestricted access to hundreds of millions of dollars in client assets. The federal agent stared at me, the immense weight of my words settling heavily into the cold interrogation room. My sister hadn't just ruined my wedding out of petty jealousy. She had attempted to use my home, my career, and my secure access as a backdoor to orchestrate a massive, unprecedented financial heist. The silence in the room was shattered by the sharp clatter of Agent Hayes typing furiously on his tablet. His fingers flew across the digital keyboard, launching a series of federal diagnostic protocols. The entire trajectory of the investigation shifted in an instant. This was no longer a localized military threat. This was a targeted cyber heist with national economic implications. David stood up, the tense line of his jaw revealing a state of hyper-focused intent. He pressed his hands against the stainless steel table, leaning over the analyst. Trace the offshore routing IPs programmed into that transmitter, David ordered, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. If Brittany tried to breach a Tier 1 financial institution through my wife, there's no way she built the back-end architecture herself. Someone supplied her with that hardware. Follow the digital breadcrumbs. Hayes nodded, his eyes locked onto the scrolling code flashing on his tablet. Already on it, Commander. I'm pulling the suspect's complete digital footprint. Financial records, cloud backups, encrypted chat logs. Based on the national security threat, we have a federal warrant for immediate data seizure. I sat frozen in my wedding dress, the sheer magnitude of the betrayal seeping deep into my bones. Brittany had always been vain, materialistic, and deeply insecure, but engineering a multi-million-dollar cybercrime required a level of calculated malice I never imagined she possessed. She was willing to let me face federal prison time for a corporate data breach just to fund her lifestyle. Agent Reynolds stepped away from the wall, pulling out a secure radio to coordinate with the field team currently searching the wedding venue. "What's the motive?" Reynolds asked, turning a sharp gaze toward me. "Corporate espionage usually involves competitor firms or foreign actors. Why would a civilian with no technical background target her own family's financial access?" I shook my head, my mind racing through decades of my sister's toxic behavior. "She's obsessed with wealth," I explained. "She constantly flaunts luxury vacations, designer clothes, and elite status. But she doesn't work. Jamal funds her entire life. Maybe he finally cut her off."
"Got it," Hayes interrupted, his voice spiking with adrenaline. The sudden noise made me jump. Hayes swiped a series of documents onto the main display screen facing us. "I just breached the suspect's offshore banking records. Commander, ma'am, you need to see this."
David and I moved closer to the tablet. The screen was filled with bank statements, wire transfers, and cryptocurrency ledger receipts. None of them carried Brittany's legal name, but all were tied to the IP address of her personal mobile device and a hidden encrypted email account. The numbers were staggering. Red lines representing debt spanned the screen, painting a picture of absolute financial ruin. "She is completely broke," Hayes stated flatly, pointing to a massive deficit column. "It looks like she got caught in a high-yield cryptocurrency scam about 8 months ago. She leveraged her and Jamal's joint assets, took out massive margin loans, and the liquidity pool collapsed. She lost everything."
I stared at the screen in disbelief. "How much?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper.
$400,000, Hayes confirmed, and that's just the baseline deficit. David let out a low breath, shaking his head. 400,000! How had an orthopedic surgeon's wife managed to hide nearly $500,000 in losses without her husband finding out? "She didn't just lose it," Agent Reynolds observed, reading the glowing text over my shoulder. "She tried to win it back. Look at these outbound routing nodes." Hayes tapped the screen, highlighting a network of transactions bouncing through dark web gateways. "Reynolds is right. After the crypto collapse, she panicked. She started funneling money into unregulated, illegal offshore gambling syndicates. High-stakes online poker, digital sportsbooks, anything with a massive payout potential. She was chasing the deficit, trying to plug the hole before her husband noticed the accounts were bleeding. But she didn't win it back." I deduced the cold knot forming in my stomach. "She dug the hole deeper, much deeper." Hayes nodded grimly. "When her own credit lines maxed out, she turned to underground lenders, unregulated loan sharks operating through crypto mixers. The interest rates were astronomical, and the collection tactics were incredibly aggressive." Hayes pulled up a decrypted conversation thread. The language on the screen was brutal and demanding. The anonymous sender demanded immediate asset liquidation, threatening to seize her property, ruin her husband's medical practice, and expose her massive financial fraud to the local police. "They gave her a deadline," David noted, his tactical mind analysing the threat matrix. "The final demand notice was for next week. She was completely out of time." The sickening reality of my sister's grand plan came into sharp focus in that cold, sterile room. Brittany had been backed into a corner by dangerous, unregulated criminals. She couldn't ask Jamal for the money, because doing so would expose her as a pathological liar who had wiped out their joint savings. It would end her marriage and strip away the high society status she valued above her family's safety. So she looked for a scapegoat. She targeted me. I stared at the blinking green light on the dismantled device in the evidence bag. "The offshore server routing protocols on this device?" I said, my voice steadying as the final piece fell into place. "Do they match the crypto wallets associated with those loan sharks?" Hayes ran the cross-reference, the progress bar loading for an agonizing 3 seconds before flashing solid green. "Yes, direct match. The data sniffer was programmed to automatically dump intercepted financial credentials straight into the syndicate's servers. Brittany never intended to steal that money herself. She was effectively handing the keys to my corporate portfolios directly to an international criminal syndicate. She intended to let them drain my clients' accounts to wipe out her own debt. She was going to destroy my career, compromise my entire institution, and leave my husband at risk of federal charges. all to save her own skin while keeping Jamal completely in the dark. The immense weight of this revelation hung heavily in the air, suffocating the room. Agent Reynolds instructed David and me to return to our home, emphasizing the absolute necessity of operational secrecy. The gears of justice were turning, but building an airtight case for corporate espionage and wire fraud takes time. We were escorted back by a discreet NCIS security detail. The next morning, I didn't wake up to the sound of ocean waves at a Maui resort. I was jolted awake by the violent vibration of my phone on the nightstand. It wasn't just a few missed calls, it was an avalanche. My screen was crowded with hundreds of notifications, text messages from distant relatives, missed calls from high school acquaintances, and a relentless stream of social media alerts. My heart hammered against my ribs as I unlocked the screen. I clicked on a text from a trusted colleague. There were no words, just a link that was being shared frantically. My parents hadn't waited for the dust to settle. Realizing their golden child was trapped in the crosshairs of a federal investigation, Richard and Patricia decided to strike first. They weaponized the only arena where their brand of manipulation always won: the court of public opinion. I clicked the link. It directed me to a GoFundMe page created by my mother, Patricia. The headline was bold and sensational. "Help save my innocent daughter from military tyranny." A wave of intense nausea hit me as I read the description. My mother had written a tear-jerking, entirely fabricated manifesto. She painted a picture of a beautiful family wedding destroyed by an unstable, aggressive military groom and his hostile colleagues. According to her post, Brittany had merely tried to present her sister with a beautiful vintage keepsake. In response, Patricia claimed my husband David ordered heavily armed individuals to tackle a terrified, defenseless young woman and hold wedding guests hostage over an innocent misunderstanding. She twisted the story with sickening precision. She wrote that I was a bitter, resentful sister who allowed my new husband to terrorize my family to settle petty childhood scores. The page begged the public for donations to hire a powerful defense attorney to fight against military overreach and unlawful detention. They had even attached a photo of Brittany from a few years ago, looking sweet, tearful, and incredibly vulnerable. The internet, always hungry for scandal, swallowed the lie whole. The campaign had gone viral overnight. The post had been shared thousands of times across local community pages and national military watchdog forums. The comment section was a horrific echo chamber of misplaced outrage. Strangers tore me to shreds, calling me a traitor to my own blood, a monster who allowed her husband to abuse civilians. There were loud demands for David to be stripped of his rank and court-martialed. Worst of all, the funding counter at the top of the screen showed that in less than 12 hours, gullible and sympathetic strangers had donated over $50,000. My parents were actively crowdsourcing Brittany's legal defense through a vicious online defamation campaign. Before I could even show the screen to David, my phone lit up with an incoming call. The caller ID displayed the name of the chief executive officer of my financial firm. My blood ran cold. The CEO never calls an employee directly on a Sunday morning. I answered, my voice tight. "Hello? I need you in the downtown boardroom in exactly 45 minutes, the CEO said, skipping any pleasantries. "Do not log into the corporate network. Bring your security badge." The line went dead. The drive to the corporate headquarters was a blur of panic and rising anger. When I walked into the sleek, glass-walled boardroom, the atmosphere was intensely hostile. The CEO sat at the head of the long mahogany table. Flanking him were the head of human resources and the chief information security officer. On the massive screen behind them, my mother's viral GoFundMe page was projected. "Sit down, Maddie," the CEO ordered, his hands clasped in front of him. "We are facing a massive public relations nightmare, and my inbox is flooded with inquiries from the board. Your family is publicly accusing you and your spouse of assault and unlawful detention. Furthermore, there are rumors circulating on social media that the police were called to your wedding regarding stolen property." The CISO leaned forward, his expression severe. "Our primary concern is institutional security. You hold a high-level security clearance. You manage back-end data for portfolios worth hundreds of millions. If your personal life is compromised by criminal activity or volatile associations, you become a massive liability to this firm. Are you under investigation by local law enforcement? I had to walk a dangerous tightrope. I needed to defend my job without violating the strict confidentiality of the ongoing NCIS investigation. I am not under investigation, I said, keeping my voice as steady and professional as possible. The individual who was detained at my wedding is currently facing federal charges. I cannot disclose specifics due to ongoing national security protocols, but I can assure you with absolute certainty that our corporate network was never breached. The threat was intercepted and neutralized before it ever reached my hardware. The executives exchanged uneasy glances. The mention of federal charges and national security clearly startled them, but it did nothing to ease their immediate concern over the viral scandal. The reality is that your name and face are currently attached to a viral campaign alleging severe misconduct, the HR head chimed in, sliding a formal document across the polished wood. Our clients demand absolute discretion and stability. We cannot have a senior data architect trending on social media over a domestic altercation involving military personnel. The CEO delivered the final blow. Effective immediately, you are being placed on indefinite administrative leave. Your corporate network access has been revoked. Your badge is deactivated. You will remain on leave until this PR disaster is fully resolved, and your name is cleared of any criminal volatility. I stared at the document. The career I had spent a painful decade building was suddenly stripped away because of my family's vindictive lies. I was being punished for being the target of an attempted cyber heist. I signed the acknowledgement with trembling fingers, handed over my security badge, and walked out of the building under the silent escort of a company security guard. I stepped into the bright afternoon sun, feeling as if the ground had been pulled out from under me. Brittany and my parents were systematically dismantling my life to save their own. I unlocked my car, sat in the driver's seat, and gripped the steering wheel tightly as a deep, burning anger finally consumed the initial shock. I reached into my bag to call David. I needed to tell him what had just happened, that my parents had just destroyed my livelihood. Before I could dial, my screen lit up with a new text message. It was from an unknown burner number, but I recognized the arrogant, commanding tone instantly. "You thought you won by involving the feds?" the message read. "You just lost your job. Your husband's rank is next. Drop the charges today, or I release the files that will ruin what's left of your miserable life." My fingers gripped the steering wheel as I read the text again. "Drop the charges today, or I release the files that will ruin what's left of your miserable life." Before I could even process the weight of the threat, the burner number flashed across my dashboard display as an incoming call. I took a deep, stabilizing breath. I hit the button to answer, the Bluetooth system connecting with a heavy, suffocating silence. "Did you think you could outsmart your own family, Maddie?" My father's voice echoed through the speakers. He didn't sound like the polished corporate executive he presented to the world. He sounded venomous, desperate, and entirely ruthless. The facade of a concerned father was completely gone. I sat perfectly still, my eyes locked on the empty parking space ahead of me. "I'm not playing games, Dad," I said, keeping my tone flat and professional. Brittany committed a federal crime. She targeted a military commander and attempted a massive cyber heist against my company. This is entirely out of my hands now.
"Nothing is out of your hands," Richard snapped, his volume rising. "You are the alleged victim. You can refuse to cooperate. You can tell your husband to call off his government attack dogs, and you can tell those federal agents it was all a massive misunderstanding. You need to fix this, Maddie, because if you don't have this handled by the end of the day, I will systematically dismantle your entire career."
I let out a short, humorless laugh. "You're a bit late for that. I've already been placed on indefinite administrative leave because of the viral GoFundMe campaign Mum started this morning. You've already done your worst." "Oh, we are nowhere near our worst," my father countered, a dark note of triumph creeping into his words. "Administrative leave is temporary. Company suspensions can be lifted once the public relations storm passes. What I hold in my hands right now is permanent. I have your file, Maddie." A cold knot formed in my stomach. "What file?" I asked, refusing to let him hear any fear in my voice. Your medical history, Richard said smoothly. Specifically, the psychiatric evaluation from when you were 22. The air froze in my lungs. In my early 20s, the relentless emotional abuse and gaslighting from my parents and Brittany had pushed me to the brink of a severe depressive episode. To survive the toxic environment they created, I sought help at a private mental health clinic. I spent a year in therapy, rebuilding my self-worth before I finally moved out and cut them off financially. It was the hardest, most vulnerable time of my life. Those records are protected by medical privacy laws. They are sealed, I said, my voice dropping an octave. You have no legal way of accessing them. Legal access is just a matter of knowing the right people and paying the right price, my father bragged, utterly shameless in his corruption. But the raw records were a little too boring for my taste. They just say you had anxiety and depression. That doesn't quite fit the narrative your mother and I are building online, so I had a specialist do some creative editing on your file. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the steering wheel. Editing? According to these newly updated documents, Richard read, enunciating every word clearly from a sheet of paper, you have a chronic, documented history of severe paranoid delusions. You are a pathological liar with a history of volatile behavior, and you have shown extreme obsession and jealousy toward your younger sister. The files state that you require heavy psychiatric medication to maintain a grip on reality, medication that you conveniently stopped taking shortly before the wedding. You forge my medical records just to paint me as unstable, I whispered, the sheer depravity of his actions hitting me like a physical blow. You're committing extortion and medical fraud just to protect a daughter who tried to steal funds for an illegal loan shark. I'm protecting my family, Richard roared, his anger flaring again. Brittany made a stupid mistake with some crypto investments. That doesn't mean she deserves to spend years in a federal facility. Those corporate accounts you manage hold millions. If she had asked, you could have easily covered her debts, but we knew you were too selfish to help your own sister. So she had to find another way. He was actually blaming me for Brittany's attempted cyber heist. In his twisted, narcissistic mind, my refusal to be their personal ATM justified my sister committing a federal crime against my husband and my employer.
Sister, if you don't call NCIS and drop all accusations against Brittany by 5 o'clock today, Richard continued, delivering his ultimatum with chilling precision, I will send this fabricated psychiatric file directly to the chief executive officer of your financial firm. I will send it to the board of directors. I will send it to the journalists who are currently covering our GoFundMe campaign. We will paint you as a completely unhinged, paranoid woman who orchestrated this entire military intervention during a psychological episode. You will never work in data architecture again. No financial institution will ever trust you with a security clearance. Your career, your reputation, and your income will be permanently gone. He paused, letting the weight of his threat hang heavily over the line. I know how much your career means to you, Maddie. It's the only thing you've ever been good at. Don't throw it away out of spite. Fix this. Call off the federal agents. I sat in the driver's seat, listening to the static hum of the Bluetooth connection. 10 years ago, a threat like this would have broken me. 10 years ago, the frightened, insecure girl who just wanted her parents' love would have folded instantly, sacrificing her own safety for a false peace. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I was a 33-year-old woman who built a highly lucrative career entirely on her own merit. I was the wife of a Navy SEAL commander who showed me what absolute, uncompromising loyalty looked like. I understood data, I understood logic, and I understood the law. My father was betting on my fear. He was relying on the old family dynamic, the one where he held all the power. He didn't realize that using a telecommunications device to commit extortion across state lines was a federal offense. He was blindly adding his own name to a federal indictment. Richard was waiting for me to cry. He was waiting for me to beg. Instead, a profound, unshakable calm washed over me. The very last thread of familial connection I had to the man on the other end of the line snapped cleanly in two. Are you listening to me, Maddie? My father demanded harshly.
his impatience bleeding through the speakers. "You have until 5. I reached out, my finger pressing the red end call button on the dashboard screen. "Do your worst, Dad," I said. I hung up the phone and shifted into drive. I was done playing defence. I was ready to go to war. It took me less than 20 minutes to pull into my driveway after hanging up with my father. My hands still slightly numb from the lingering adrenaline and absolute clarity. The house was quiet, the heavy oak front door secured. When I walked inside, I found David standing in our living room, his arms crossed over his chest. He was staring at a large flat-panel monitor mounted on the wall. The screen currently split into a grid of high-definition surveillance feeds covering every conceivable angle of our property. I walked up to him, tossing my keys onto the counter. "My dad just called me from a burner number," I said, wasting no time on pleasantries. "He fabricated a psychiatric evaluation from when I was 22. He's threatening to release the documents to my company's board and the press by 5 o'clock, claiming I have violent paranoid delusions if we don't drop the federal charges against Brittany." David didn't look surprised. He didn't panic either. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face, a look that told me he had been expecting them to do something desperate. "Interstate extortion," David noted, his voice carrying that familiar, icy tactical calm. "Fabrication of medical records, witness intimidation. Your father is handing the federal prosecutors a wrapped, guaranteed conviction on a silver platter." I looked up at the monitor. The cameras provided a crystal-clear view of our driveway, the street, the backyard, and the perimeter fence. "I told him to do his worst," I admitted, stepping closer to my husband. David turned to me, a fierce pride gleaming in his eyes. "Good, because they're already here." A soft, melodic chime echoed from the security console. In the top left grid of the monitor, a silver luxury SUV turned aggressively onto our quiet suburban street. It didn't pull into the driveway. Instead, it parked sideways along the curb, deliberately blocking the entrance. The doors flew open. Richard, Patricia, and Brittany stepped onto the sidewalk. They looked entirely different from the arrogant, high society snobs who had tried to command the room at my reception just 24 hours ago. Patricia wore a wrinkled cardigan, her hair intentionally disheveled. Richard had discarded his expensive suit jacket and tie, his shirt collar open, looking unkempt and frantic. Brittany was the center of the production. She held a smartphone mounted on a stabilized gimbal, pointing the camera directly at her own face. Her eyes were red and swollen, streaming with fresh, perfectly calculated tears. "They're broadcasting live," I realized, watching Brittany stare sorrowfully into her phone screen as they began their slow march up our driveway. David tapped a key on the security console. The external perimeter audio feed instantly flooded our living room in crisp, high-definition surround sound. "We are walking up to the house right now," Brittany sobbed to her digital audience, her voice trembling with manufactured terror. "If you're just joining the stream, my sister is trapped inside with her new husband. We just want to make sure she's safe. He's a trained military operative who had his friends attack me yesterday. We are so scared, but we have to try and reach her." Patricia walked to her right, looking anxiously toward our front door. "Please, Maddie," Patricia wailed, performing for the thousands of strangers tuning into their GoFundMe sympathy broadcast. "We love you so much. Please come out. We know he's controlling you." I stood in the living room, staggered by the sheer audacity of their performance. They were actually trying to frame a Navy SEAL commander for unlawful detention to save themselves from a federal cyber heist prosecution. It was staggering, narcissistic delusion. They wanted David to open the front door, lose his temper, and shout at them so they could capture an angry, aggressive military man on camera to validate their smear campaign. But they had made a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. David's house was not a standard suburban build. As a high-ranking officer who regularly handled classified intelligence from a home office, his property was outfitted with a security array designed by defense contractors. It didn't just record video. It was equipped with highly sensitive, multi-directional parabolic microphones hidden in the porch light fixtures, the driveway pillars, and the decorative stone planters. On the surveillance monitor, the trio stopped halfway up the driveway. Brittany lowered her phone slightly, angling the camera toward our front door, showing her audience the imposing silent house. Believing they were temporarily out of microphone range, their entire demeanor shifted in the blink of an eye. The fake tears vanished. "Make sure you get the house number in the frame," Richard barked in a low, harsh whisper, his voice stern and demanding. "I'm trying," Brittany snapped back, wiping a stray tear from her cheek with a rough, aggressive swipe. "Get ready, both of you. If that muscle-bound freak opens the door, you start screaming immediately. Make him look as aggressive as possible. The donation counter on the page just hit $60,000. Keep crying, Mum." Patricia adjusted her wrinkled cardigan, her face contorting into a vicious smirk. "If the little brat doesn't open the door, I'm throwing a rock through the front window," Patricia muttered. "We need to capture the confrontation before the 5 o'clock deadline, or Richard's extortion threat is useless." They took a deep breath, perfectly resetting their faces into masks of profound grief, and lifted the camera once more.
"Maddie, please," Brittany wailed as they stepped onto our front porch, resuming her performance flawlessly. "We're begging you, just come out."
In the living room, David and I stood side by side, listening to the crystal-clear, high-definition audio of their whispered conspiracy echoing through our speakers. Every single threat, every admission of extortion, every undeniable piece of evidence proving their live stream was a premeditated, fraudulent shakedown had just been captured and automatically uploaded to a secure cloud server. "They walked right into it," I whispered, staring at the monitor in awe. "They dug their own grave," David corrected, crossing his arms as he watched my family frantically pound on our heavy front door. "And we're going to let them keep digging. No contact, no response. We just gather the data." Richard began hammering his fist against the oak door, shouting for the camera. "David Thorne, open this door. We have a right to see our daughter. Stop holding her hostage." The hypocrisy was sickening. The man screaming for my safety was the exact same person who, less than half an hour ago, had threatened to destroy my career with forged psychiatric records. They were delivering the performance of their lives, completely unaware that the stage they stood on was recording every malicious whisper. Suddenly, a sharp, screeching turn of tires interrupted my father's shouting. On the surveillance monitor, a black, sleek sedan came tearing down the street, braking violently as it pulled in directly behind my parents' parked SUV. David leaned forward, narrowing his eyes at the screen. "We have company." The driver's side door of the sedan flew open. A tall man stepped out, his stride rapid and determined, radiating absolute fury. He slammed the door shut, not even bothering to grab his suit jacket from the passenger seat. It was Jamal, and he looked entirely unconcerned with the family live stream. Jamal marched up the driveway with heavy, deliberate steps. He was wearing his teal surgical scrubs under an unbuttoned dress shirt, a clear indication that he had rushed over directly from the hospital. On the high-definition monitor in the living room, David and I watched the entire dynamic on our front porch shatter instantly. Patricia, oblivious to the storm brewing behind her, continued to wail into the camera with her face buried in her hands. Richard was mid-sentence, shouting another threat at the front door, when he finally noticed his approaching son-in-law. My father instantly adjusted his posture, attempting to draw Jamal into their twisted production. "Jamal, thank goodness you're here," Richard boomed, amplifying his voice for the live-stream audience, gesturing dramatically toward our house. "We're trying to get Maddie out of there. David has completely lost it. He's got her locked inside. Tell the viewers what happened at the wedding." Jamal didn't even blink in my father's direction. He walked straight past Richard, ignoring the older man completely, as if he were nothing more than a piece of lawn furniture. He stopped exactly 2 feet from Brittany. Brittany lowered the smartphone slightly. The moment she saw her husband's face, the fake tears dried up. The sheer, unadulterated rage radiating from Jamal was chilling. This was not the calm, collected orthopedic surgeon who regularly played golf with my parents. This was a man whose entire reality had just been violently torn apart. "Jamal, what are you doing here?" Brittany asked, her voice faltering. She took an involuntary step back, hitting the brick wall of our porch. "We're live. We're trying to save my sister. How did you find me?" she added, her eyes darting nervously toward his car parked at the curb. I put a GPS tracker on your luxury SUV, Brittany, Jamal stated. His voice was dangerously low, captured perfectly by David's hidden parabolic microphones. Patricia gasped, clutching her pearls. Jamal, that is a severe invasion of privacy. How dare you track your own wife like a common criminal? Jamal turned his head slowly to look at my mother. The absolute disgust in his eyes made Patricia physically recoil. I tracked her, Jamal said in a lethal tone, because this morning I logged into my corporate banking portal to run payroll for my surgical staff, and I discovered that our joint practice accounts have been completely drained. An absolute dead silence followed. In the living room, David let out a low whistle. They didn't just wipe out her personal savings, she stole from his business. Brittany swallowed hard, her knuckles turning white around her smartphone. The livestream was still running, capturing every second of her public undoing. Jamal, baby, you're mistaken, she stammered, trying to force a weak, placating smile. That's just a bank error. The bank probably froze the accounts because of the investigation yesterday. We can call them tomorrow and sort it out. Please don't do this right now. There are thousands of people watching us. We need to focus on saving Maddie. Jamal closed the distance between them, towering over his wife. I called the bank, Brittany. I spent 3 hours on the phone. They didn't freeze the accounts. They traced 4 separate wire transfers authorized by your secure digital token. 4 transfers over the last 30 days, routed directly to an unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchange. He took another step closer, his voice rising, the vibration of his anger rattling the windows. You didn't just gamble away our personal savings. You liquidated the operating capital for my medical practice. You stole from my partners. You stole from the people who work for me. You committed massive financial fraud against my business. Richard stepped forward, raising his hands in a soothing gesture. Now, Jamal, let's not say things we can't take back. Brittany just made a small mistake with some investments. We're family. We can handle this quietly, in private. We don't need to air dirty laundry in public. A small mistake, Jamal roared, spinning violently toward my father. He thrust a finger directly into Richard's chest. How dare you stand there and cover for her? I know you were complicit in this. The bank flagged a secondary transfer, routed directly into a holding account under your name. Richard, you used my surgical practice to pay off your own debts. I gasped, my hand flying to my mouth. In our living room, the complete picture of my family's depravity finally fell into place. Richard wasn't just covering for Brittany out of blind parental devotion. He was an active co-conspirator. Together they had drained Jamal's corporate accounts to pay off loan sharks. When their money ran out, they attempted to plant the surveillance device to drain my corporate funds next. It was a coordinated family crime syndicate driven by financial collapse. Brittany realized the game was completely over. Her husband knew everything. Her father's complicity was exposed. And the live stream, the tool she had intended to use to destroy my life, was currently broadcasting her own ruin to tens of thousands of viewers. She panicked. She lifted the phone higher, trying to angle the camera away from Jamal and back toward our front door. Everyone, Jamal is just under a lot of stress. Brittany babbled into the lens, her voice rapid and breathless. He's not thinking clearly. The military personnel must have threatened him. We need to call the police to save Maddie. Help us. Please keep donating. Jamal stared at her, entirely repulsed by the creature she had become. She was backed into a corner, facing federal charges and absolute financial ruin, and her only instinct was to continue begging strangers for money on the internet. He didn't say another word. Jamal simply reached out, his hand moving with a sudden violent momentum. He snatched the phone right out of Brittany's hand, mid-broadcast. Brittany shrieked as the device was ripped from her grip. The camera angle spun wildly, capturing a blurred image of brick sky and Patricia's terrified face, before Jamal's massive hand covered the lens entirely. The video feed on the surveillance monitor went black, but the high-definition audio continued to capture every decibel. "Where did you put my money, Brittany?" Jamal slammed the smartphone down onto the concrete porch. The sharp, metallic crunch of shattering glass and snapping electronics cut through the air, instantly silencing my mother's wailing. The live stream was over, but our security microphones caught every frantic breath. "Answer me," Jamal growled, his voice vibrating with a rage that seemed to shake the very foundation of our porch. "Where did the 400,000 go, Brittany? Where is the operating capital for my surgical practice?" Brittany shrank against the brick wall, her hands coming up defensively. The polished, manipulative golden child was completely gone. She was a terrified, cornered animal now.
"Jamal, you're scaring me," she whimpered, trying to slide behind my father. "Please, it was an error. I was trying to invest. I wanted to double the money so we could buy that waterfront property you always wanted."
"You stole from my partners to play crypto markets," Jamal interrogated, pressing closer, forcing Richard to shuffle awkwardly to the side. "You forged my signature on wire transfers. Do you realize that is a federal felony? The FBI is already reviewing the routing numbers." The mention of the FBI broke her completely. The reality of a federal investigation, piled on top of the NCIS probe into her wedding espionage attempt, crushed whatever remaining sanity she had left. Brittany dropped straight to her knees on the concrete porch, sobbing hysterically. "I didn't want to do it," she screamed, her voice hoarse, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger directly at Richard. "He forced me to. Dad told me to do it." The colour drained from Richard's face, leaving it a sickly ashen grey. "Brittany, shut your mouth right now," he ordered, his voice tight with rising panic. "You don't know what you're saying. You're hysterical." "I'm not lying," Brittany shrieked, crawling backward like a crab to create distance between herself and her father. He was in debt. He owed the same loan sharks I did. They threatened to cause him physical harm if he didn't pay by the end of the month. He told me to drain your practice accounts, Jamal. He said you made so much money, you'd never notice it was missing." Patricia gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. She whipped around to face her husband, her eyes wide with absolute horror. "Richard," she breathed, her voice shaking. "What is she talking about? What loan sharks?" Richard tried to grab Patricia's arm, but she recoiled violently. "Patty, listen to me," he pleaded, his corporate mask completely dissolving into pathetic desperation. "The girl is unhinged. She's trying to drag me down to save herself." "You know she's a liar." "She's telling the truth," Jamal stated coldly. His eyes were fixed on my father with complete disdain. The bank traced a transfer of $150,000 directly from my stolen funds into a holding account registered to a shell company, a company that lists you as the primary beneficiary, Richard. "Inala Chen, you took the money." Patricia stared at her husband, the life they had built together disintegrating before her eyes. For decades they had maintained the image of the perfect, wealthy suburban family. They had constantly looked down on me, reminding me of my failures while flaunting their own success. Now the grotesque truth was stripped bare on my front porch. "You have a gambling addiction," Patricia whispered, the devastating realization hitting her. "You told me you stopped going to the casinos 5 years ago. You swore on our marriage." "I just had a run of bad luck," Richard snapped, his temper flaring as he found himself completely cornered. "I was trying to win back what we lost in the real estate crash, Patty. It got out of hand. I borrowed from the wrong people. They were going to hurt me. I had to do something." "So you told your daughter to steal from her husband?" Patricia screamed, finally finding her voice. "You told her to steal from my son-in-law to pay off your dirty debts. And when that money ran out," Brittany yelled, desperate to shift the blame entirely to her father, "he told me to go after Maddie. He bought the tracking device. He told me to plant it at her wedding so we could get her corporate passwords. He said Maddie's clients had hundreds of millions, and she'd take the fall for us." The sheer absolute finality and depravity of their plot hung heavily in the air. In the living room, David and I stood stunned. My father hadn't just been covering for Brittany. He was the mastermind. He had orchestrated the theft of his son-in-law's business and directed a cyber attack against my financial firm, fully intending to let me take the blame and face federal prison just to clear his gambling debts. Jamal looked at the family he had married into, a look of profound revulsion crossing his face. "You are all disgusting," he said quietly. "Every single one of you. I'm going straight to the FBI field office. I'm handing over every financial record, every bank statement, and every piece of evidence I have against you." Jamal turned and began walking down the driveway toward his sedan. He didn't look back. He didn't care about the smashed phone, the ruined live stream, or the woman sobbing on the porch. He was a man cutting out cancerous, rotting flesh from his life. "Wait! Jamal, please!" Brittany wailed, scrambling to her feet and stumbling down the driveway after him. "You can't leave me here. They'll ruin me. The loan sharks will ruin me." Before she could even reach his car, the distant wail of sirens cut through the suburban quiet. It wasn't the familiar high-low tone of local police cruisers. It was the heavy, aggressive pulse of federal enforcement vehicles. At the end of the street, 4 matte black SUVs turned the corner simultaneously, moving in a tight, tactical formation. They accelerated rapidly, tires screeching as they swarmed the front of our property, completely blocking the driveway, trapping Jamal's sedan and my parents' luxury SUV. The doors of the federal vehicles flew open in perfect synchronization. A dozen heavily armed agents flooded the street, their tactical vests emblazoned with bold yellow letters reading NCIS. Right behind them came several agents in FBI jackets. The raid was officially underway. Agent Reynolds stepped out of the lead vehicle, his tactical boots hitting the asphalt with a heavy, authoritative thud. Behind him, the dozen federal agents fanned out across my manicured lawn, weapons held in a low, ready position. The flashing red and blue emergency lights of the federal vehicles reflected off the brick facade of my home, transforming the quiet suburban street into a chaotic, active crime scene. Inside, David tapped the security console, releasing the electronic locks on the front door. "Let's go," he said, his voice carrying a low, satisfied rumble. Time to watch the finale. Together, we stepped out onto the front porch, standing securely behind the invisible line the agents had rapidly formed. The evening air was cool, but the atmosphere in our driveway was absolutely blistering. "Richard Vance and Brittany Vance," Agent Reynolds barked, his voice carrying easily over the rumble of the idling engines. "We are in possession of federal warrants for search and seizure, authorized by a United States District Court judge. Place your hands on your heads immediately," fingers interlocked. My father stared at the wall of federal agents, his corporate executive arrogance flaring up in one final, pathetic display of resistance. He lowered his hands, puffing out his chest, as if he were addressing subordinates in a boardroom rather than a tactical federal task force. "Listen here, Agent," Richard announced, attempting to project authority. "There has been a massive misunderstanding. I am a respected corporate executive. I demand to speak with my legal counsel before you take another step onto my daughter's property." "You are standing on a federal crime scene, Richard," Agent Reynolds replied, his tone entirely devoid of patience. "You are the primary suspect in an organized cyber espionage attempt against a military official, compounded by interstate wire fraud and illegal gambling activity. Place your hands on your head right now, or you will be physically non-compliant." Richard swallowed hard, his bluster shattering into a million pieces. The reality of his situation slammed into him with absolute weight. He slowly raised his trembling hands, interlocking his fingers over his thinning hair. 2 agents stepped forward, swiftly subjecting him to a physical search. They pulled a wallet, car keys, and his sleek corporate smartphone from his pockets. Then, an agent patted down his ankle, pulling up the cuff of his tailored trousers to extract the cheap plastic burner phone he had used to extort me just an hour prior. I watched the exact device used to threaten my livelihood get sealed into a clear federal evidence bag. A profound, chilling sense of triumph washed over me. Patricia watched her husband get searched like a common street criminal. She let out a piercing shriek, clutching her chest dramatically. "You can't do this to us," she wailed, stamping her feet on the sidewalk. "We are the victims here. Our daughter and her volatile husband were holding us hostage." An FBI agent pointed a stern, uncompromising finger directly at her. "Ma'am, step back. Any attempt to interfere with the execution of a federal warrant will result in your immediate arrest for obstruction of justice." Patricia collapsed onto the edge of the gravel driveway, her expensive designer cardigan dragging through the dirt. The pristine, untouchable image she had spent a lifetime carefully building was gone, completely shattered. Nearby, federal agents turned their attention to Brittany. She remained on her knees, staring blankly at the shattered remains of the smartphone Jamal had destroyed just minutes earlier. A female NCIS agent approached her with authority, instructing her to stand. Brittany wobbled up, her heavily beaded dress torn and ruined. Trembling, she pointed a finger toward Jamal, sobbing that he broke her phone. Jamal stood quietly by his vehicle, watching the entire scene with an icy detachment. Brittany cried out that her husband had ruined everything, and she had nothing left to give them. Agent Reynolds signaled toward the luxury silver SUV my parents had arrived in, and a team of investigators quickly swarmed the vehicle. They popped the trunk and pulled out a high-end leather laptop bag. Brittany panicked, suddenly breaking out of her daze as she saw her luxury belongings being handled by the authorities. She screamed that her laptop and tablet were inside, demanding they leave them alone, because her entire life was stored on those drives. Reynolds explained calmly that her digital footprint was now federal evidence. Under the warrant, they were seizing her cryptocurrency ledgers, her offshore accounts, and the logs detailing her unauthorized financial network. The female agent then held out an evidence bag, ordering Brittany to hand over her smartwatch immediately. Brittany looked down at her wrist. It was a limited edition, diamond-encrusted watch she constantly flaunted online to project an image of wealth and status. Losing her phone, laptop, and secret accounts was devastating, but being forced to hand over her ultimate status symbol pushed her over the edge. She completely lost control. Having lived a life of immense privilege without ever facing consequences, she snapped. She screamed that they were ruining her life, her voice echoing down the street.
Instead of complying, Brittany made a catastrophic mistake. She lunged forward, her hands raised, and aggressively swiped at the agent's face.
The agent didn't flinch. With remarkable speed and precision, she deflected the clumsy attack, grabbed Brittany's outstretched arm, and used her own momentum to spin her around. The agent pressed her forward, sending her chest first against the cold hood of my parents' luxury SUV. The heavy thud of metal echoed through the driveway, instantly silencing my mother's wailing. A second later, the sharp, unmistakable sound of handcuffs locking into place signaled the end of the line. Brittany screamed out in anger, her face pressed against the vehicle. The agent methodically removed the diamond watch, dropped it into the evidence bag, and secured the seals. The reality of the situation finally broke through the adrenaline. The golden child was officially under arrest. Patricia managed to find one last burst of desperate energy. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting frantically across the chaotic scene. She looked toward Richard, who stood completely broken, staring blankly at the ground. She looked toward the porch where David and I stood, entirely unmoved. Finding no sympathy there, she turned toward her son-in-law. Stumbling toward him with outstretched hands, she begged Jamal to do something, claiming the agents were hurting her daughter. She pleaded with him to call his lawyers and pay whatever it took to secure her release. Jamal stood perfectly still. He didn't offer comfort, nor did he step back. He simply let her frantic demands wash over him. He looked at Brittany struggling against the hood, and then at Richard, the man who had actively plotted to drain his business capital. Patricia grabbed his arm, shaking it, begging him to protect his wife. Jamal slowly, deliberately removed her hand. His face was a mask of controlled anger and absolute disgust. He squared his shoulders and looked Patricia dead in the eye. He told her plainly that Brittany was no longer his wife. He called her out for stealing from his partners, lying to his face, and attempting to compromise federal security data involving her own family. He made it clear he wouldn't spend a single cent on her defense, revealing that his lawyers were already drafting divorce papers. He told Patricia that she and Richard had created this monster, and now they could watch her face the music alone. Patricia gasped, stepping back as if struck. She whimpered that he had promised to protect her. Jamal countered fiercely, stating that Brittany had shattered those promises the moment she treated his clinic like a personal piggy bank to fund her illegal debts. He told her the entire family was a fraud. Turning his back on her completely, Jamal walked across the driveway, bypassing the agent's logging evidence, and walked straight toward the porch where David and I stood. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, the anger in his eyes fading into a deep, exhausted sorrow. He looked up at us and offered a sincere apology. David gave a brief, yet understanding nod, noting that Jamal had been kept completely in the dark by design. Jamal shook his head, admitting he should have seen the red flags earlier, but had ignored them because he wanted to believe the perfect image my parents projected. He expressed deep regret for what they tried to do to me, and for bringing that threat near David's home. I stepped forward, looking down at a man who had been used just as ruthlessly as I had. I told him softly that he was a victim in this too, explaining that while they tried to frame me, they used his livelihood to fund their deception. I assured him he didn't owe us an apology. Jamal let out a small tired smile, thanking me for understanding. But he added that he refused to remain passive, intending to ensure they could never ruin anyone else's life again. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a sleek black metal flash drive. Turning back toward the driveway, he approached Agent Reynolds, who was supervising the seizure of Richard's electronics. Jamal handed over the drive, explaining that it contained a fully encrypted backup of his entire household network. He revealed it held a mirrored drive of Brittany's personal desktop, complete logs of their joint accounts, and automatic backups from every device connected to their Wi-Fi. All captured the moment he noticed the missing clinic funds.
Agent Reynolds raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden cooperation. He verified if Jamal understood that volunteering the drive gave them unrestricted access to everything, including incriminating data against his wife. Jamal confirmed with absolute finality that he wanted them to have everything.
Reynolds took the drive, nodded in appreciation, and sealed it inside a heavy plastic evidence bag. The sharp sound of the zipper sealing shut echoed through the quiet neighborhood like a final bell tolling for my family.
Richard witnessed the entire exchange from the side of the SUV. The colour drained from his face entirely, leaving him a sickly, translucent pale. The arrogant corporate persona he had used to intimidate me my whole life shattered completely. The reality of a federal investigation, the loss of his high society status, and total public exposure seemed to drain the very air from his lungs. The sheer weight of his impending legal consequences physically crushed him.
Ignoring the agents documenting his seized burner phones, Richard broke away, stumbling down the gravel driveway toward the porch. An NCIS agent moved to intercept him, but David raised a commanding hand. The agent paused, allowing Richard to approach while keeping a watchful eye on his erratic movements. Richard didn't climb the stairs. He dropped heavily to his knees on the hard concrete at the base of the porch, the sharp gravel tearing into his expensive tailored trousers. He looked up at me, his face covered in sweat and tears born of pure, selfish terror. He begged me to make it stop, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine I had never heard in my 33 years of life. He pleaded with me to use my influence to fix it. I looked down at the man who raised me. This was the man who had spent my entire childhood comparing me unfavourably to my sister. This was the man who, just an hour ago, had threatened to destroy my career with fabricated mental health records. I felt absolutely no pity. I told him coldly that I couldn't stop a federal investigation. I reminded him that he had committed severe offences, attempting corporate espionage and targeting a military household. Richard sobbed, crawling closer until his hands gripped the bottom step of the porch. He clasped his hands together in a desperate plea, arguing that it was just money, a drop in the bucket for the large portfolios I managed. He begged me to clear his debts so his creditors wouldn't come after him, promising they would leave me alone forever if I just wrote the check. The sheer delusion of his request left me speechless. David shifted his weight beside me, making Richard flinch slightly, but desperation overrode his fear. I looked at him with absolute disgust. Even now, he believed money could solve everything, viewing my hard-earned career as a private fund for his illegal habits. I made sure my voice carried across the yard so the agents could record every word, stating clearly that he was asking me to commit financial fraud to bail him out of a mess caused by his own offshore gambling. Patricia, still sitting in the dirt near the vehicles, let out another wail. The harsh truth had finally landed. The wealth, status, and prestige she valued above all else were gone forever. Her husband was on his knees, exposing the corrupt core of their lives to the entire neighborhood. Richard continued to plead, invoking family ties and claiming I owed them loyalty. He warned that if I let them lock him up, I would destroy the family and carry the guilt forever. I walked to the very edge of the porch, looking directly down into his eyes. I felt no guilt, no obligation. The phantom chains of childhood trauma and parental manipulation vanished into the evening air. I told him with absolute finality that the day he tried to frame my husband was the day he ceased to be my father. Over the next 3 weeks, the initial shock of the raid settled into a tense, agonizing silence. Brittany and Richard were released on federal bail, their passports seized, and their movements restricted by electronic ankle monitors. My mother's online fundraising campaign remained active, somehow pulling in nearly $100,000 from sympathetic strangers who bought into their story of an innocent family being targeted. They used every dime of those funds to retain one of the most aggressive defense attorneys in the state. Meanwhile, I remained on indefinite paid suspension from my firm. Executive leadership was terrified of the public relations fallout, paralyzed by the negative attention my parents' smear campaign had generated. The career I had spent a decade building from scratch hung in the balance. Then the official notice arrived via certified courier, bearing the gold emblem of a notoriously ruthless law firm. David stood by my side as I broke the seal and scanned the heavy paper. It was a formal demand for a private mediation session. My family wanted to meet at their lawyer's downtown office, claiming they wished to resolve the dispute amicably to avoid a prolonged legal battle that would ruin everyone's reputation. David let out a sharp, humorless laugh, calling it exactly what it was: extortion born of their terror of federal prison. As I turned to the second page, my blood ran cold. Attached to the demand was a heavily redacted copy of a fabricated psychiatric evaluation from 11 years prior, filled with highlighted phrases like severe instability and delusional paranoia. It was the fake medical record my father had threatened to use. Clipped to the top was a handwritten note from their attorney, strongly advising me to attend the mediation and sign a full liability waiver, dropping all claims. It warned that if an agreement wasn't reached by Friday, they would release the records to my employer and the press to explain away the raid. They had officially weaponized the fabricated documents, using crowd-funded money to execute an organized extortion plot. They assumed that because my career was suspended, I would be desperate enough to capitulate and sign away my right to justice. David looked at the document, his jaw tightening. He noted that they had crossed the line from a desperate defense into blatant witness intimidation and extortion. I stared at the highlighted lies designed to destroy the one thing I truly owned: my professional reputation. My family had spent my life trying to convince me I was unstable whenever I set boundaries. Now they were trying to legalize that manipulation to save themselves. I picked up my phone and dialed the lead NCIS agent on the case. I informed Agent Reynolds that their defense counsel had sent a formal mediation request attached to a fraudulent medical report, threatening to leak it to the press unless I dropped all charges. There was a brief pause before Reynolds responded, his tone turning razor sharp. He noted that extortion was a direct violation of their bail conditions and asked if I was willing to attend the meeting. I looked at David, who gave a slow nod. I told the agent I would meet them on Friday afternoon, letting them think they had won. Reynolds agreed, stating they would coordinate with the federal prosecutor's office, advising me to dress for a victory lap. Friday afternoon arrived with a heavy, oppressive humidity. The defense attorney's office was located in a sleek glass high-rise in the heart of the financial district, projecting an aura of immense wealth and power. I chose not to wear a sharp business suit. I didn't want to look like a desperate corporate employee fighting for her job. Instead, I wore a simple, elegant navy dress that projected absolute calm. I walked into the luxurious reception area alone and was escorted into a massive glass-walled conference room overlooking the city skyline. My family was already seated around the long mahogany table. Patricia sat rigidly, hands folded, trying to look like a wronged matriarch. Richard sat next to her, looking smug and overconfident, fully believing his fabricated document was the ultimate trump card. Brittany sat at the far end, refusing to meet my eye, her fingers tapping nervously on the polished wood. Their defense attorney, an older man with slicked-back silver hair and an aggressive demeanour, stood at the head of the table. He motioned toward an empty chair, smoothly stating he was glad I decided to be reasonable. He gestured to the non-disclosure agreements and liability waivers, claiming that once signed, my records would remain private and my workplace suspension would likely be lifted by Monday. I remained near the heavy glass door, making no move toward the table or the paperwork. I looked my father straight in the eye and called him out for hiring a lawyer to extort me with forged documents. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, a malicious, triumphant smirk spreading across his face. He dismissed the accusation, calling it a negotiation. He claimed I had backed them into a corner and they were simply using their leverage so everyone could get their lives back. I tilted my head, a genuine smile breaking across my face. My father's blind arrogance was his undoing. He truly believed he was the smartest person in the room. I told him clearly that I wasn't signing a thing. The attorney frowned, his smooth demeanour slipping as he warned that refusing to sign would result in the immediate release of the evaluation, destroying my career. I took a deliberate step backward, pushing the heavy glass door wide open. I told them they wouldn't be releasing anything because they had no leverage left. All they had was a federal indictment. David walked into the room, his commanding presence immediately dominating the space. But he wasn't alone. Beside him stood Special Agent Reynolds and a woman carrying a heavy briefcase bearing the seal of the United States Department of Justice. The federal prosecutor had arrived. The silence that followed was absolute. In less than a second, the atmosphere in the room shifted from arrogant confidence to pure terror. Richard's smirk vanished, replaced by a dropped jaw as he stared at the government seal. Patricia gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white, while Brittany shrank back into her chair. Their high-priced attorney froze, his predatory confidence dissolving instantly. As an experienced legal professional, he knew the disastrous implications of a federal prosecutor crashing a private mediation. He realized immediately that his clients hadn't just lost their leverage, they had actively escalated their crimes into a massive federal problem. Agent Reynolds stepped forward, commanding the room. Ignoring the attorney entirely, he looked directly at my father. He called Richard out by name, stating that while he was already under investigation for cyber espionage against a military official, he had chosen to commit interstate extortion and forge medical documents to threaten a federal witness. The defense lawyer quickly raised his hands in a placating gesture, trying frantically to regain control. He argued that it was merely a private mediation to resolve a family dispute through a civil settlement. The federal prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman with an uncompromising expression, stepped past David. She opened her briefcase and slammed a thick stack of folders directly onto the center of the polished table. The loud thud made Brittany flinch. The prosecutor made it clear there would be no civil mediation, informing the lawyer that his clients were facing a full federal indictment. She listed the charges, which included violations of the Federal Wiretap and Espionage Acts, conspiracy to commit corporate cyber fraud, and now witness intimidation and interstate extortion. The attorney's face lost all colour. He looked down at the fabricated report sitting next to his own files, realizing the document he intended to use as leverage was now primary federal evidence. He took a deliberate step back from the table, physically distancing himself from my family. Patricia panicked, screaming that they were law-abiding citizens with reputations, accusing them of ruining their lives over a minor computer mistake made by Brittany. She turned to me, begging me to make them stop. I looked at my mother, completely unmoved by her frantic display. I told her calmly that they had ceased to be my family the moment they decided my career and sanity were acceptable collateral damage to pay off gambling debts. They had chosen their reputation over my safety, and now they had lost both. The prosecutor opened the top folder, completely ignoring Patricia's outburst, and pulled out an official document bearing a court seal. She announced that the FBI's cybercrime division had officially frozen the fundraising account Patricia had set up under false pretenses. Using a fabricated narrative to solicit funds across state lines constituted wire fraud, and every dollar had been seized by the federal government to be refunded to the donors. Patricia gasped, clutching her chest. The online campaign had been their lifeline, the only way they could afford the high-priced representation in the room. Without it, They were completely exposed. Brittany wailed, finally finding her voice, protesting that the money was theirs to pay for their defence. Agent Reynolds cut her off sharply, advising her to exercise her right to remain silent, as every word was being recorded for the ongoing investigation. Recognising the situation was entirely hopeless, and facing the potential loss of his licence for participating in an extortion scheme, the defence attorney quickly packed his notes. He didn't look at Richard or Patricia, nor did he offer any comfort to Brittany. He stated tightly that he needed to consult with his firm's managing partners regarding representation, noting that the introduction of federal charges and the seizure of funds forced them to re-evaluate their position. He was abandoning them. The moment the money evaporated, their paid loyalty vanished. My family was left completely isolated, trapped in the ornate room by the consequences of their own actions. David stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with the prosecutor. He looked down at Richard, his voice low and dangerous as he called him out for threatening his wife, infiltrating his home, and trying to destroy her career to cover up his own failures. He told him he had made a catastrophic mistake by thinking he could intimidate her. Richard slumped into his chair, a completely broken man. He stared at the forged documents on the table, the evidence of his final gamble, now serving as the final nail in his coffin. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer another excuse, but the door opened once more. The final piece of the puzzle had arrived. Jamal walked into the room, dressed in a sharp, impeccably tailored suit, radiating an aura of calm authority. He didn't look angry or rattled. He looked entirely resolved, like a man systematically removing a toxic element from his life. Brittany cried out, scrambling from her chair and rushing toward him, begging for help and claiming they were being threatened with federal charges. Jamal didn't reach out to comfort her. He sidestepped her frantic approach with clinical precision, walking right past her toward the defense attorney. Jamal announced he had documents for the lawyer to accept on behalf of his clients. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a heavy sealed envelope, sliding it across the polished wood until it hit the attorney's briefcase. He instructed the lawyer to open it and read it aloud for the record. The attorney swallowed hard, his hands visibly shaking as he broke the seal. He pulled out a stack of legal documents. The first was exactly what Brittany feared most, a petition for an expedited, absolute divorce on the grounds of severe financial fraud. Jamal added that the second document was a permanent restraining order, signed by a superior court judge that morning. It barred Brittany from coming within 500 feet of his residence, clinic, vehicle, or person, warning that any attempt to contact him would result in immediate arrest. Brittany let out a sharp cry, collapsing onto the carpet, wailing that she had no money and nowhere to go. Jamal ignored her entirely, instructing the lawyer to read the third document bearing the federal seal. The lawyer pulled the final document from the envelope, his jaw dropping as he scanned the header. He looked at Brittany with pure dismay, announcing it was an official case opening from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Jamal confirmed the details, delivering the final blow. He explained that when Brittany decided to use stolen funds in the cryptocurrency market, she hit an identity verification wall. Needing a clean, high-tier credit profile to secure large loans, she stole his social security number and forged his signature on federal tax documents and financial disclosures to bypass security. The prosecutor looked impressed, noting that identity theft to defraud a federal financial institution carried mandatory minimum sentencing. Jamal concluded by stating he had handed over every IP log and forged signature to the authorities that morning. He revealed that she hadn't just stolen from his business, she had committed major identity theft and tax evasion. The IRS was already moving to seize her personal accounts, vehicle, and jewelry to cover the fraudulent debts, leaving her with absolutely nothing. The reality of the situation hit the room like an explosion. While the wiretap charges were severe, the IRS Criminal Division was an unstoppable force that would strip away every asset Brittany had ever touched. Realizing no amount of manipulation could save her, she fell flat onto the floor, letting out a scream of pure panic while hitting the carpet in vain. Patricia watched her golden child completely fall apart. The mountain of criminal charges, the insurmountable debt, and the total destruction of their social standing proved too much for her to handle. She let out a short gasp, her eyes rolling back as she fainted for the second time, collapsing onto the floor next to her screaming daughter. Richard made no move to help his wife. He was powerless. Agent Reynolds grabbed him by his collar and pulled him from his chair, ordering him to put his hands behind his back. Richard offered no resistance. The arrogant man who had threatened to ruin my life just hours prior was now completely submissive as heavy steel handcuffs locked around his wrists. He was led out of the glass doors, paraded down the hallway past shocked receptionists and legal assistants as a disgraced criminal. The defense attorney dropped the envelope back onto the table, announcing immediately that he was withdrawing his counsel for Richard, Patricia, and Brittany. He stated flatly that he would not represent clients facing active IRS and federal espionage indictments. He turned and left the room, leaving my family entirely defenseless and in federal custody. Jamal stood amidst the ruin of the family he had married into, adjusting his jacket with an eerie calm. He walked out of the conference room, leaving the chaos behind, and took the elevator down to the lobby, washing away the final remnants of his marriage. David and I were waiting on the warm sidewalk when the glass doors opened and Jamal stepped into the sunlight. He looked exhausted, but his posture carried an undeniable lightness. The heavy burden of my family's manipulation finally lifted from his shoulders. He walked toward us, offering no grand speech, but simply reached out and shook David's hand firmly. Then he turned to me. He told me quietly that it was over. The tax documents had finished them, the lawyer had abandoned them, Richard was in cuffs, and Brittany had nothing left. I looked at my former brother-in-law, a man who had shown incredible integrity in the face of massive betrayal. I thanked him from the bottom of my heart for protecting us. Jamal offered a small, genuine smile, noting he was protecting himself too, but expressed his happiness that I was finally free of them, adding that I deserved a good life. With a final nod, he turned and walked down the bustling city street, blending into the crowd as a free man, leaving the ashes of my toxic family far behind. I watched him disappear into the sea of pedestrians, his confident stride carrying him away from the ruins of our shared past. David placed a reassuring arm around my shoulders, guiding me toward his truck. The suffocating fear that had weighed on me for 33 years was entirely gone, evaporated into the afternoon air. We drove home in a comfortable, triumphant silence. The federal justice system moved with slow, irresistible certainty, grinding what was left of my family to pieces. The months that followed played out like a fast-moving news montage on local networks, documented in harsh court transcripts. Richard Vance stood before a federal judge, completely stripped of his tailored suits and arrogant corporate posture. Wearing a standard jumpsuit, his shoulders slumped as he faced the court. The judge offered no leniency, pointing out that weaponizing fabricated medical records to extort a witness was an act of severe malice. My father was sentenced to 12 years in a federal facility with no possibility of early parole. Brittany faced her own harsh reality. The golden child appeared in court without her heavy makeup, designer dresses, or social media filters, weeping openly as the judge sentenced her to 8 years for her role in the cyber espionage scheme. The financial consequences were even more devastating. The authorities auctioned off her luxury vehicle, designer bags, and every piece of jewelry to pay the fraud penalties and restitution to Jamal's clinic. The woman who built her identity on flaunting wealth was reduced to a federal inmate number with 0 assets to her name. Patricia was the only one to avoid prison time, but she found herself trapped in a prison of her own making. As a named co-conspirator in the fraudulent fundraising campaign, she was held legally responsible for the financial fallout. To satisfy federal orders and repay the donors, the government forced the immediate liquidation of her large suburban home. A former neighbour mentioned that on the day of the foreclosure, my mother was forced to pack her remaining clothes into cheap trash bags. Her high society friends, terrified of being linked to a federal extortion case, avoided her entirely, blocking her number and ensuring she was barred from the community. She now lives in a tiny apartment overlooking a noisy intersection, completely cut off from the lifestyle she valued more than her own flesh and blood, spending the rest of her days in total social isolation. Jamal, on the other hand, flourished. Free from the financial drain and emotional manipulation of his marriage, he expanded his clinic and opened a second location. He sent us a warm holiday card last December, confirming he had successfully moved on with his life. As for my own career, my suspension was lifted the morning after the raid. The CEO called me personally to offer a deep, unreserved apology, asking me to return with a significant raise and a promotion to Executive Director of Data Security. The board realized that my integrity and quick actions had saved the institution from a catastrophic, multi-million-dollar data breach. Now, a full year after that disastrous wedding reception, the crushing anxiety that defined my life has been completely erased. I stepped out onto the terrace behind our secure, peaceful home. The evening air was warm, filled with the scent of blooming jasmine. The security system hummed faintly in the background, serving as a reassuring shield rather than a preparation for conflict. David stood by the railing, watching the sun dip below the tree line, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet. He looked completely relaxed, the tactical tension of the past year entirely melted from his shoulders. I walked up behind him, wrapping my arms around his waist and pressing my cheek against his back. He turned around to pull me into a warm embrace, handing me a glass of wine. His eyes softened as he looked down at me, reflecting a deep, steady affection. There were no more frantic burner phone calls, no more manipulative guilt trips, no more forged documents, and no more forced apologies. The quiet in our home wasn't the tense silence of waiting for the next conflict. It was a deep, absolute peace. I was no longer the family scapegoat. I was a successful, respected woman who had fought for her independence and won a decisive victory. I took a slow sip of my wine, savouring the stillness of the moment. I looked up at my husband, the man who saw my worth and stood like a wall of steel between me and the people who tried to destroy me. A genuine smile spread across my face, and I rested my head against his chest, letting out a soft laugh. I teased him lightly, saying that the next time someone brings me a gift, I'll let him scan it first.
Maddie's journey teaches us a powerful lesson. Shared DNA is never an excuse for toxic behaviour. For years she endured relentless manipulation simply because they were family. However, true family is defined by mutual respect and protection, not exploitation. Her ultimate freedom didn't come from financial success. It came from the absolute courage to draw a line in the sand and hold people accountable for their actions.
Walking away from those who harm you is never a failure. It is a vital act of self-preservation and self-love. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with toxic relatives to protect your peace? Share your story in the comments below.